We can hear you? Oh, no, we can't hear. Oops, we can't hear you yet. Hold on a minute.
Oh, wait. Hello? I think it has to be Chris.
Okay. Now let's just stand over here. Okay, would you try speaking now?
Sure. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can actually. It's perfect.
Great. Thank you so much, and thanks so much for working with Skype on this. I'm sorry about the transportation problems.
No, it's fine. And let me just introduce your paper, and I'll introduce the panel too. So just in one moment, and let me know if you can't hear me. So I'm very pleased to have all of you here for this panel. My name is Melinda Hall. I'm a professor of philosophy at Stetson University in Florida. I'm very excited to introduce all of our panelists, including our first paper from Victoria Adams at the University of Michigan. What we're going to do is each person will present their paper, and I'll give 10 minutes for questions after each. And if there's a surplus of time at the end, we'll take questions for all the panelists. So Victoria's presenting Promoting the Repellent, Queer and Disabled Bodies in Abject Art. Victoria, are you ready?
I am, yes.
Good.
Just whenever?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, great. In a critique of Julia Kristeva's theory of objection, Jennifer Stone claimed, quote, "Whenever theory is used to explain the repellent, it runs the risk of promoting it," end quote. The meant is a word of caution. Promoting what is seen as repellent could also lead to important social and ideological change. Art that showcases the abject qualities related or assigned to socially marginalized individuals may cause viewers to rethink their biases about the physical, physiological, and behavioral affects that mark individuals as other. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. The perspective this art delivers can be especially important in forming a common front to combat social oppression and subjugated identities. In this presentation, I will focus on the ways affects related to disability and sexuality are viewed and reconfigured through abject art. My original analysis considered the work of 5 conceptual artists, but for this presentation, I will focus on one in particular, Australian artist Linda Dohmen. Using web programs and viewer-guided simulations, Dohmen constructs a narrative through her images that is mainly defined through disease, injury, and their relations to sexuality. Even the titles of Domen's work, including words like gash, monster, and kill, can bring on feelings of disgust. Through the changing view of a digital medium, including audio and zoom properties, people who view Domen's work can bring themselves closer to these elements than is typically comfortable. Viewers can also then reject them in turn by closing the screen or walking away. Dohmen causes viewers to rethink the dominant gaze through the interactive qualities of her work, her emphasis on the abject expulsions of the body, such as blood, hair, fat, and decay, and the way she repositions familiar stories. The disruptions offered in her art pieces work to upset the power dynamics at play between the object and the viewer, or grotesque and normal. As the object can invade upon those who experience it, I argue that these artworks do not remain merely observed. The dynamics of viewer and subject are important in this exploration of horror. Abject art works with sensory cues that relate to social conceptions of horror in order to challenge a viewer's gaze. This has the potential to disrupt power structures that assign one as object or subject. A critical understanding of power and supposed objective response can be yielded to disrupt the social subjugation that both people with disabilities and lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and otherwise non-heterosexual and gender non-conforming identities face. Disability and LGBTQ identities are both misunderstood and stigmatized in Western society. The reasons for these subjugations can be found within theories of abjection. Non-normative bodies or beings disrupt the dichotomous statues of power that cultures rely upon. Looking at the ways in which theories of disability, queer identity, and objection can be inscribed onto art forms can be helpful in understanding abstract thoughts in relation to identities and shifting aesthetic standards. I argue that art featuring the abject does not work to recategorize rejected affects as beautiful or not, but instead disrupts the concept of beauty as a whole in ways that could benefit subjugated identities. In this presentation, I am not looking at how specific bodily constructions form disability, nor how sexual practices are queer. Both queer and disability identities are not objective systems of classification, and they depend upon the ways people choose or are forced to identify. It is important to mention that I'm not seeking to label disability or queer sexuality through specific sensory cues that these group social status can bring about, nor am I attempting to essentialize bodies as disabled or queer. However, in looking to the ways people with disabilities and queer individuals are subjugated or portrayed as grotesque, I will be referring to negative cultural views of these identities that rely upon assumptions or stereotypes. That said, my use of terms such as grotesque or normal should be imagined with quotes around them. I'm not speaking to the actual presence of bodies, but to society's categorizations of individuals in relation to acceptability. By seeking to answer why certain aspects of the body, like fluids, displaced parts, or illness, bring about disgust, the naturalness or objectivity of these responses can be refused. Looking at the symbols that signify disease or impairment through context aside from being inscribed onto queer individuals or people with disabilities, people may be able to look at them as not necessarily entwined, and so see their rejections located on these affects instead of the bodies that contain them. By more closely examining one's own responses to these sounds or images, people may also rethink what or who horrifies them. There are several themes that persist through Linda Dohmen's work that are relevant to theories of objection within disability and queer identities. The first theme I will be discussing relates to disassembled bodies. Decontextualized bodies are defined through their absences in corporality, not their identity. An arm removed from its source does not negate the identity of its bearer, but rather highlights the disruptive elements of that person, places them further outside the realm of a normal being. At the same time, it questions the identities the individual holds. Is a queer arm still queer? And if an injured arm is detached from its body, does it still possess a disability? Removing body parts from their source questions the strength of their labels, while at the same time highlighting their position outside of health or naturalness. Dohmen's work uses scanned parts from live volunteer bodies as an art medium. Dohmen makes fluid the assumed borders of a body through their disassemblage and reconstruction. In Cyberflesh Girl Monster from 1995, these decontextualized figures dance across their CD-ROM program in ways that give them life beyond their intended function. As this program is also interactive, the viewer urges on these body parts as they steer the narrative she is presenting. This work questions the essentialization of bodies and shows them to be truly malleable in definition and function. By working in this way, Dohmen places both importance and irrelevance onto the bodies to which each part is joined. LGBTQ bodies show the true fluidity of being that is systemically rejected in order to regale queer sexuality as a lesser opposite of heterosexuality. The ways through which a disabled body maneuvers the world are also contrary to assumptions of order and normality. Assemblages or functions that are outside standard behavior or design can invoke hatred through the meanings assigned to them. The ways a disabled body is marked as existing between life and death, through visualized or imagined disassemblage, is, quote, death infecting life, the utmost of infection, unquote. By literally decontextualizing bodies, Dohmen forces the viewer to confront the anxieties that this association can cause. Additionally, this work pushes against both compulsory heterosexuality and able-bodiedness by showing the perforations within those identities. The next theme I will discuss a bit is that of monstrous femininity. Dohmen digs into the cultural rejection of women by highlighting their femininity and centering work around the aspects of womanhood that cause fear in Western culture, specifically related to their sexualities or placement as disabled compared to male-bodied individuals. The figures portrayed, with exaggerated makeup or sideshow screams imitating moans, parody the aspects of being a woman, a sexual woman, or a woman with a disability that bring upon their rejection. Barbara Creed's definition of a monstrous feminine creature is one where either the sexual or reproductive qualities of the figures are made explicit in constructing a horror character. Following Creed's The Monstrous Feminine, Angela Smith produced Hideous Progeny, Disability, Eugenics, and Classic Horror Cinema. Smith analyzed horror films that feature people with disabilities in the role of monster. She wrote on how theories of the abject could be used to explain the mixture of attraction and revulsion that audiences are made to feel towards disabilities within horror. Both authors look to the ways that tropes relating to gender, sexuality, and disability are used as shorthand to signify to the audience that a character is maleficent or malformed, hideous, and psychotic. This conflation of evil with disability, gender, and sexuality serves to press an agenda of rejection. Dohmen's work capitalizes on cultural sensationalism of individuals whose sexuality is made invisible, or conversely viewed as horrific or immoral, as occurs for both queer individuals and people with disabilities. By showcasing breasts and genitals or portraying individuals in explicit positions, she forces viewers to confront the feelings they have regarding sexuality amongst individuals who hold abjected identities, and question why the acts are viewed in a separate category than other sexual behavior. The trappings of femininity, or an explicit sexuality, are not the only aspects of this theme that relate to horror. There is also a disjointed perception of sexuality as it relates to queer women and women with disabilities, where they are often assumed to be asexual or masculinized, depending on the nature of the disability and sexuality, and so are met with disgust when they claim erotics and desire. Dohmen's work, Cyberflesh Girl Monster from '95, is, as evidenced of the title, focused on the theory of monstrous femininity. Hands that crawl across the screen are manicured with elongated nails that resemble claws. Bleeding ears contain the presence of, or the potential for, hanging jewelry. The narratives inserted into the piece describe women's casual, daily situations that end in horror or murder. In My Gash from '99 also takes on this theme. The title, evoking the slang term for a vulva, relates to a series where, quote, 4 wounds are entrances to the nightmare interior where the stories and horrors of bodily memory emerge under the cursor on screen, unquote. The character the viewer literally enters, named Lying Ugly Mess Bitch, fits male fantasies of a damaged, dangerous girl. This stereotype or porn trope is pushed to the point of violence, and the sexualized aspect of her identity are overwhelmed by her physical and psychological disabilities. Through this contrast, Dohmen plays at the line between what is sexy and what is grotesque. The last of Linda Dohmen's themes that I will discuss is focused on showcasing abnormalities. The figures within these artworks are made spectacles. However, when enacted with care, these pieces can be read as rejecting the shame that is expected from aspects of the abject or grotesque that become associated with bodies. By making bodies or sexualities the forefront of this piece, Dohmen forces viewers to confront that which they may fear, and thus their own responses. The portrayal of these aspects is usually unadorned with other components of identity or cultural symbols. This is opposed to the monstrous femininity theme, where the pairings of abject affects and themes that traditionally code one as object create the strength and force of the image. In Dohmen's Typhoid Mary from '91, the main figure whose narratives are shown possess physical and physiological disabilities closely tied to their sexualities. These are highlighted through Dohmen's images. In one screen, the viewer faces close-up images of stitched flesh, paired with eyes and fabric that draw to mind either labial folds or blood. The text accompanying this image brazenly reassures, quote, "There is nothing wrong here." The viewers of this piece must deal with this apparent contradiction and rethink how they conceptualize wrong. Additionally, someone witnessing this art piece also confronts what it is about this image that marks it as a contradiction, and what assumptions led them to that thought. I Know You Think It's Too Late from 2007 is an installation that requires the viewer to interact with abject horrors in order to control violence across the screen. Hair, blood, and fat, bodily substances as might be left behind after violent death, move and respond to one another, quickly accelerating if not interrupted by the person viewing the work. The only way to balance this grotesque display is to directly confront it, pushing against the human impulse to reject these figures. Margaret Shildrick wrote that women and people with disabilities become horrific in opposition to the straight, able-bodied, white, cisgender male as a normative center. People with disabilities, and I would argue queer individuals, must then be rejected or cast out in order to maintain this imbalance of power and untainted purity. The temporary status of ability or disability factors heavily into its objection. As one can never be free from the threat of disability, reminders of disabled bodies are more violently rejected. Images that showcase the factors of disability rather than veiling them in attempts to remove their threat disrupt the positions that are necessary to maintain power relations. When people with disabilities or queer individuals display their perfect unsocialized bodies, the order that maintains the status quo is threatened. The aspects of these artworks acknowledge social prescriptions as they flip the cultural assumptions that inform them. By making a standard body part grotesque by removing its context, and at the same time refiguring the background that marks a body as abject, Dohmen gives movement to labels of normality. This serves to question the intrinsic assumptions that originate from one's culture. Sexuality is in turn hid away or unveiled in order to disrupt erotic responses, and the definitions society imposes upon others' lives. The work of this art is not to prove beauty or redefine social hierarchies. Rather, when read together, these aspects of artwork successfully bring to question the placement of stigma upon the other by showing the ways all figures cross the binary between normality and abnormality. There are disruptions within each of these pieces, whether obtuse or more insidious, that cross boundaries and question the formation of supposed objectivity. It is not surprising that many of these themes seem like they could describe curio cabinets or boardwalk exhibitions. These works are titillating because of the confusion they press onto the spectator. However, the themes present in these artworks do not simply display objection and disability and sexuality for the shock value of disruptions. They do not necessarily dehumanize their subjects. Rather, these pieces prod at the confusions they cause as a point of vulnerability to expose deeper context and humanity. The unsettling of social norms is not limited to the subjects of the art either. They show how people and things necessarily exist in the liminal space between normal and abnormal. This defines normality as a fluid and tenuous identity, rather than a powerful standard that directs actions and emotions. The act of looking, listening to, or experiencing art can also reconfigure patterns of the dominant gaze. While the viewer is traditionally the one who is acting upon or actively initiating the action, art has the potential to subvert the gaze and reposition the order of privileged or object through the ways the person observing the art experiences its affectations. Using irony or dramatics, art can also force one to rethink their biases and assumptions, or experience the impotence of their personal power at its enactment. Tobin Siebers wrote in relation to disability aesthetics that, quote, beauty is a radical concept. His rationale is that beauty is always about extremes. People desire to possess the beautiful at the same time they want to gawk at it. Following this description, beauty and the grotesque are not far from one another. Abject art allows for both the consumption and the enactment of beauty as one wavers between the viewed and the viewer. People can make themselves an object as they view the art they wish to embody, while also remaining in an exhibitionistic role as the art spectator. The fluidity of power dynamics as one views art that is both attractive and abject forces the viewer into roles not typically occupied. If these positions are uncomfortable or evoke new feelings, the person experiencing art has the opportunity to rethink the context that developed the emotions with which she or he is confronted. Displaying abject aspects of human experience through art can provide a meaning beyond stigma and assumptions. They provide a context that can hold stereotypes to the viewer's exposure that is unlike the interactions a person would have when simply citing what they perceive as disfigurement or immorality. By experiencing art that portrays these themes, a viewer must confront the humanity of the individuals possessing these bodies. The viewers are also locked into a sensory-driven confrontation with their own biases and repulsions. By witnessing abject bodies within art, the viewer cannot dismiss or ignore that which upsets their consciousness. Abject art forces one to observe and listen to narrative silences. Disability and queer sexuality have an important stake in discussions of objection and spectatorship. Though these identities may be invisible, any outward knowledge of otherness has the risk of being met with hatred and revulsion. Negative feelings towards people with disabilities or LGBTQ individuals relate back to ideas of morality and health. These are the very institutions that objection can disrupt. Additionally, since societal norms of beauty and decorum encourage the hiding away of bodies that deviate from the norm, the act of showcasing physical markers of disability or alternative gender and sexuality can serve as an act of rebellion. By either explicitly showing what society wants of individuals, or by deliberately rejecting unwritten rules of conduct, Dohmen's viewers are made to look not only at a body, but the context that is forcing a name and pattern of behavior onto it. Through these art pieces, one can see the act of cultural inscription occurring even as they may be having their own unconscious reactions that contribute to the stigmatization. Experiencing these sensations in tandem has the potential to shake up a person's beliefs and alter their actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. So now we'll take about 10 minutes for questions. We're probably going to go slightly over this session, and just to let you know early. So each person will have 20 minutes and then about 10 for questions. So would anybody like to ask our Phantom panelist questions? I have a question, Victoria. I have read a bit in disability studies about essentially debates over whether or not art created from an abled perspective can be, politically revolutionary for disableism, right, or ableism. Is it the case, do you think it's problematic for an abled artist to create images with connecting sort of abjection and persons with disabilities, or is there still something is there potential for something productive there still?
Yeah, I think actually in my larger piece I address that a little bit more because with the artists that I talk about, I don't consider the fact of their ability or disability or their sexual orientation. And I think that in the perspective that I'm looking at, where I'm finding themes within their art that relate back to ways that abject portrayals of disability or sexuality can be more revolutionary, I think that can be less problematic because the artists are not necessarily portraying disability as much as themes of the rejection of people with disabilities. But I know that there's been a lot of pushback with certain artists, like, I'm totally blanking on her name. She does the gorgeous black and white photography. I don't remember.
The woman with the famous images of people from an asylum in the middle of a field, is that the one, like the carnivalesque?
Yeah, she does a lot around carnivals, and actually I know she had received a number of letters from an association of little people, which includes a wide variety of disability related to stature and height, saying we have our own photographers to take our own images. We don't need you to be exploiting us. So I think that there's a difference between seeking out people with disabilities in order to show them in a more spectatorship or exhibitionistic role, versus focusing art on the somewhat violent rejection of people who are outside the realm of normal. And I think there's a thin line, but at least in my head, I think there's a distinction there.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thanks very much for the paper. I was just wondering whether you would mind mentioning the other artists that you said were part of the larger project and would be interested in what
Of course.
Maybe say a little bit about them.
So of the 5 artists, so there's Linda Dohmen, Jenny Seville, Karen Finley, Joe Spence, and Clarissa Sly. Yeah, and also if I can read out my email to you guys, or if the organizers want to make it available, I would be totally happy to take any questions or to send you. I have more images or the written copy of this. If you want a list of the other artists' names or anything like that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be wonderful, and I think we will share email addresses later on in the conference. And so for now, I think we'll go ahead and we'll leave a little bit more time at the end for questions, and they can come back to you. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, thank you so much, Victoria. So now I'm very happy to introduce Josh Dohmen from the University of Memphis, and he'll be giving his paper, Disabled Singularity, Feminine Genius.
Thank you. So I just want to start by saying that throughout the paper I use the term disabled person or disabled subject, even though it's I think more common in disability studies literature to say person with disability or whatever. I do that because Kristeva uses that language, and also because I'm pretty convinced by certain Marxist strains in disability literature that want to focus on the processes which are disabling. So I do not mean to offend. That's my choice of language. Okay. Kristeva writes in Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, and Vulnerability that, quote, disabilities are multiple and singular. My aim here is to discover in what sense disabled subjects are singular for Kristeva. Her comments on the vulnerability and dependence of disabled subjects are reminiscent of the work she does in developing a specifically feminine singularity in her Female Genius trilogy. So it is my hope that in understanding what Kristeva means by feminine genius, we can better understand the singularity of disabled subjects. The paper will proceed then in 3 steps. First, I will give a summary of Kristeva's view of feminine genius. Second, I will develop an interpretation of Kristeva's work on disability and draw certain parallels between this account and feminine genius. Finally, I will briefly comment on Kristeva's rhetoric of disability to respond to a lingering fear about her seeming essentialism. Kristeva begins her trilogy with a brief history of the concept of genius, which, as she later writes, is, quote, the most fertile version of singularity at a given historical moment. The genius for Kristeva puts existence into perspective or encourages us to re-narrate existence and in so doing, be reborn ourselves. Moreover, geniuses are extraordinary, and yet their qualities are common. The geniuses about whom she writes are singular, Kristeva tells us, because their work is intimately tied to their lives. Indeed, she defines a genius as one whose creations are so closely tied to her biography that we must discuss her story in discussing her work. In doing so, we realize that they are geniuses for us. That is, they're not extraordinary in some questionable objective sense, but in relation to their biographers. Moreover, they make us realize we too are potential geniuses, as we too have stories to be told and creations to wonder at. So she asks, what role do women play in all this? Here, Kristeva suggests that women's lives uniquely express singularity. Kristeva's writings on the lives and works of Hannah Arendt, Melanie Klein, and Colette throughout the trilogy, those writings are perhaps the most illustrative source of insight into this unique form of singularity, but she schematizes these in the final chapter of Colette. Feminine genius is, first, a result of the cultivation of singular subjects within relationships. This insight follows from Kristeva's psychoanalytic development of understanding the female as a, quote, psychic being of connectedness, who participates in and is concerned with real human relationships. And yet, the complicated, creative, psychosexual development of females will be unique for each subject, as each will navigate the process in her own way. This is why Kristeva says, woman does not exist, but singular womans. Second, feminine genius collapses life and thought into one another. Life is the life of the mind, and thought is living thought. This is specifically feminine because, on Kristeva's account of psychosexual development, the female subject is dependent but also capable of achieving a maturity, an understanding of real relationships, and a valuing of coexistence because she is a subject of connectedness. Though this means that feminine genius is uniquely vulnerable, it also means that it is more embedded within concrete relationships, and therefore more immune to abstraction than masculine forms of genius. Finally, feminine genius exhibits a cyclical temporality, emphasizing birth and rebirth, creation and recreation, over a masculine linear temporality. Again, this is uniquely feminine for Kristeva because she sees in women's maturity and concern for real relationships an openness to cyclical time manifested in generations, births, and rebirths. Though Kristeva sees in the lives and works of Arendt, Klein, and Colette a transcendent freedom achieved through their oppressive female conditions, each subject has such a potential. Every subject, Kristeva writes, invents a specific sex, a sexual identity specific to a given subject, yet a variation on a dominant trait. That subject's creativity in inventing a psychosexual identity is the source of singularity and of each subject's potential genius. A genius for Kristeva pushes singularity to its limit by being an extreme variation on dominant traits, yet the singularity can still be shared. That is, it can be understood and inspire us too to be geniuses, since we all vary on the same spectrum of dominant traits and are capable of creation and recreation. To achieve genius, we must be willing to take risks, to call things into question, and to make ourselves vulnerable, as Arendt, Klein, and Colette did. Only through these actions will one be able to be free through her condition. Having given a brief overview of Kristeva's understanding of specifically feminine singularity, I'll turn to her work on disability. Then, after considering both developments individually, we'll be better able to see how these two lines of thought enrich one another. The key insight of Kristeva's essay on disability is her argument that the exclusion of disabled persons is based on the way in which they narcissistically wound others by confronting them with the perceived possibility of psychical and physical limitation and death. Kristeva traces this rejection of the disabled individual to the narcissistic denial of the lack of being essential to the human condition. The psyche constructs myths of self-sufficiency and completeness. These narcissistic fantasies are pierced when we're confronted by a person with a disability, such that we are, at the same time, confronted with our own limitations or the possibility of death. But the experience of this narcissistic wound goes beyond our own recognition of individual deficiencies by extending to our very conception of humanity. What do we understand as human, for example, when confronted with a person surpassed in intelligence by certain non-human animals? Intelligence, of course, needs to be included there. And what have come to be known as autism spectral disorders may problematize how we conceive of the human as a social animal. So the sort of Aristotelian definitions we get of human sort of become questioned. Our experiences with disabled persons are thus analogous to the confrontations with foreign others, as discussed in Kristeva's earlier work, Strangers to Ourselves. The experience of the other is here thought in terms of Freud's uncanny. A confrontation with death, the feminine, or the drives is experienced as uncanny because these are aspects of ourselves which our psyche seeks to deny by repressing them into the unconscious. That is, it is at once foreign as a denied part of the self, and at the same time familiar as part of one's unconscious, however deeply it's buried. But the foreigner, according to Kristeva, is experienced as strange or uncanny because she confronts us with the existence of our own foreignness to ourselves. Foreigners are strange, alien yet familiar, just as the repressed contents of our unconscious. And these contents are called to consciousness in confrontation with foreigners. It is tempting to reject the other who confronts us with these repressed portions of our psyche because of the narcissistic wounds they, like the other figures of the uncanny, inflict. But in doing so, we also disavow portions of ourselves. Thus, the ethics that Kristeva finds in psychoanalysis is based on both the recognition of the other and the recognition of the stranger within our own psyche, the working through of our own unconscious. Repeated encounters with the other make it possible to confront and work through this strangeness of one's own unconscious, as well as the strangeness of the other. The confrontation with the disabled other, however, narcissistically wounds us in a different way. It does not call to consciousness the strangeness of our own unconscious, but the recognition of our own vulnerability. Even though the confrontation with the disabled other is a confrontation with our own limitations, Kristeva maintains that there is a categorical difference between the disabled and the non-disabled person. She writes, quote, "The disabled subject is confronted with the irremediable lacks or insufficiencies that evolve within certain limits when they don't stagnate or worsen. Thus, while the non-disabled person confronted with a disabled other may be forced to confront her own limitations, these limitations admit of alleviation. A broken leg heals, a social skill can be acquired, but the experience of the disabled person is one of insurmountable limitation." So it's tempting to push Kristeva on this issue. It seems that the line between remediable and irremediable limitations is in no way fixed or clear. Might it not be better understood as a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind? Indeed, Kristeva herself problematizes the issue. She writes, "Yet the analysand who has not confronted the irremediable in himself has not completed his journey to the end of the night. Every subject," she's claiming, "has irremediable limitations. What then distinguishes a disabling limitation from a non-disabling one, or a disabled subject from a non-disabled one? It is not simply that the limitation of the disabled subject is irremediable, but that this irremediable limitation results in a unique, quote, exclusion that is not like others, because of the narcissistic wound it inflicts upon those without the same limitation. It is not just the suffering of the limitation, but the suffering of the exclusion caused by this limitation, which sets disability apart from other forms of incurable vulnerability." So to summarize, disability differs from other narcissistic threats in revealing the subject's vulnerability. and it differs from other forms of vulnerability in that it results in profound social exclusions based on the narcissistic wound. What does this mean for Kristeva's therapeutic goal? Kristeva defines the subject as that which remains open to a search for meaning and sharing. Thus, when Kristeva aims to acknowledge the disabled subject in her singularity and to encourage interaction with disabled persons, her goal is to enable and share in this search for meaning beyond simply integrating them into social or economic structures. Integration for Kristeva, this is a quote, has a whiff of charity about it, toward those without the same rights as others. That is, the disabled person may be integrated into a community, but the community remains itself unchanged. Members of the society will still have superior rights. It's by their grace that the disabled are integrated among them, and the narcissistic integrity of non-disabled subjects is left intact. Interaction, on the other hand, requires both the disabled and non-disabled subjects to be open to one another and to recognize the other as a subject capable of a search for meaning and psychic rebirth. As we've seen, though, such interaction is largely barred by the narcissistic wound inflicted on others by disabled persons. Thus, Kristeva holds that this can only be achieved by acknowledging and working through the vulnerability which is central to every human subject. Only in grappling with our own vulnerability can we hope to have a meaningful interaction with those who painfully bring our vulnerability to consciousness. For Kristeva, psychoanalysis is, unsurprisingly, uniquely suited to this project. To share vulnerability, though, is not simply to understand or empathize with the other, for as Kristeva warns us, this sharing cannot take the form of identification. To identify with the other would be to refuse her singularity and the uniqueness of her experience. Rather, to share is to interact with the other, acknowledging that each is vulnerable, but in an irreducibly singular way. Moreover, sharing is at once recognizing that the disabled subject is vulnerable in a way that cannot be shared, and yet being open to the voices of disabled persons who are willing to share their experiences and exclusions with us. This is a speculative claim, but I get it from strangers to ourselves. So I think this also means that we will be open to, we will ourselves be open to the hatred disabled persons may feel toward us as a result of their expectation of exclusion. So any sort of narcissism that might be built up against those who they're expecting to exclude. Sharing, then, is done by the disabled subject, not imposed upon her by the identifying gestures of others. Through this sharing, we can form common goals with disabled persons, in which the working through of repressed fears and narcissistic injuries is transformed into attention, patience, and solidarity, capable of refining our being in the world. In confronting our own vulnerability, we not only open ourselves to the possibility of interaction with disabled subjects, we also develop ourselves. Here we can see why it is that Kristeva refers to disabled persons as singular. Recall that genius for Kristeva is an exemplary form of singularity. The genius's qualities are common, and yet the genius is extraordinary by placing the existence of others into perspective. Our encounters with disabled others have exactly this potential. Their vulnerability is common, yet it is extraordinary in placing our own vulnerability in perspective. Indeed, these encounters have the potential, according to Kristeva, to transform our fears into patience and attentiveness. Might Kristeva have discovered not only the singularity of the disabled, but disabled genius? This comparison can be developed more schematically. First, we see a parallel between the singularity of women and the singularity of disabled subjects based on their relationships of dependence. Relationships allow for the cultivation of singularity for Kristeva. They are not the result of a subject's weakness. Disabled subjects, like the feminine subjects Kristeva discusses, are often embedded within relationships of dependency and vulnerability. That is, they too are likely to be psychic beings of connectedness. As such, they are capable of just such a singularity. Masculine-abled subjects, on the other hand, seek autonomy, disavow vulnerability, and thus often reject acknowledging the centrality of relationships in their own development in order to maintain the myth of self-creation. Second, as a result of being relational in a way similar to the feminine genius, life and thought will not be separate for disabled subjects. The disabled subject, like a female subject on Kristeva's view, is also grounded in reality by human relationships, and thus likely to deny the separation of thought and life. Her thinking reflects the concrete reality in which she lives, not the abstract formal thought of masculine-enabled subjects. Indeed, a disabled person may well face challenges in living that ground her thought to a greater degree than the feminine subject. A person whose disability causes one to be constantly concerned for her own health, or whose social participation is challenged by structural obstacles, will need to devote significant thought to the concrete realities of her existence beyond her social connectedness. Moreover, this may dispose disabled subjects, like feminine geniuses, to a cyclical temporality. Embedded in caretaking routines and dependency relationships, the disabled subject may become more aware of the potentials for birth and rebirth, creation and recreation, but also painful repetition. Third, Kristeva tells us that the oppressive condition a woman is subject to means that there is a unique situation for her to transcend, should she be willing to take the necessary risks, and a unique perspective from which to call things into question. Her marginalized psychosexual position then affords grounds for developing her singularity and possibly a transcendent genius. The disabled person is subject to similar marginalization. Disabled persons, too, have unique conditions to transcend. While each person develops a singular psychosexual identity, this identity is a variation from a dominant trait that can be shared. The case of disability is formally analogous. The disabled person's exclusion, though based on the narcissistic wound she inflicts on others, is a result of vulnerability. Since every person is subject to irremediable vulnerabilities, the disabled subject's vulnerability is an extreme variation on a dominant trait and is thus potentially shareable. Yet the narcissistic wound suffered by others leads them to exclude the disabled subject in a profound way. This is a position of marginalization and thus a position to transcend and from which to call the non-marginalized into question. In lieu of a standard conclusion, I'd like to briefly address Kristeva's rhetoric of disability. So Jan Gru has a paper called Rhetorics of Difference, Julia Kristeva and Disability. And it analyzes the way that Kristeva talks about disability. So there's not space here to engage with his entire paper, but there are just a few points I'd like to address. First, Gru claims that Kristeva's rhetoric of we and they, the disabled and non-disabled, reifies rather than contesting our understanding of disability. So it's certainly true that Kristeva's rhetoric opens her to this criticism. She does talk in this way. But I think that a more generous reading is possible. If my reading above is correct, then what distinguishes disabled subjects from non-disabled subjects is their social exclusion that is based on the narcissistic wounds they inflict on others whose narcissistic integrity is threatened by the confrontation with their own vulnerability. This means, first, that persons with different disabilities as defined by the ADA, for example, may be narcissistically wounded by and therefore exclude others. A person with a physical disability may reject a person with a mental disability, for example, especially if that person is especially tied up in intellectual prowess as part of her self-image or something like that. Second, this means that who is disabled is contingent upon the narcissistic denial of various vulnerabilities by others. A mass acceptance of certain human limitations, if incorporated into individual psyches, would completely alter who is disabled on this account, and could even eliminate disability as a category, maybe only in a utopia. It is not, as Gru worries, that Kristeva conceives of disabled persons as serving only to induce therapeutic change in others, that is, the non-disabled. Rather, Kristeva conceives of this as a promising avenue for social change by all.
Thank you very much, Josh. Open up for questions to him.
Thanks very much for your interesting paper. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just ask you a couple. I think for one thing, I think it's very helpful to focus on singularity. I think that's a really important question. But I have a couple of questions about that. One is you used an interesting phrase at one point, the disabled genius, which seemed to suggest that you were kind of meaning what Kristeva says about singularity and vulnerability say, LGBT communities, or what specifically, what is it about the narcissistic within the disabled body is imposing upon us that some other challenging sexuality, for example, is not? Can you just maybe say a little bit about that?
Right. So I think I take a reading of, or I read Kristeva in a way that is open to, is fluid and open to changing social categories, and I think I need to think through more what I think of as like sort of a social imaginary or something like that, that which informs our narcissism, right? But as I imagine it, as I'm conceiving it here, the disabled subject, so the first question was why think of that as a particular form of singularity, the disabled?
I'm just kind of worried, the sort of idea of just the sort of Olympics of oppression, where one marginalised community is somehow more marginalised than any other, and the problem of that.
Right.
But also thinking that there might be some resources in your own analysis, particularly with this phrase, just kind of connecting it as you did in this interesting way with the idea of genius. If as you pointed out at one point, that we could maybe even think of the genius as a disabled genius in some ways, that seems to be deconstructing the opposition that at another level we seem to be pushing. So that's
I see. Yeah, I'm not really sure how to respond to the second point. I need to think more about that. But as far as thinking about more singular, or being more of a genius or something like that, I think of them just in terms of being different and not more or less. So a disabled singularity, or perhaps disabled genius, maybe, is one that is defined in a certain way, and that is based on these experiences of exclusion based on the narcissistic wound that they inflict, which is different from, but not more or less than, the sort of singularity that I think Kristeva is trying to find in the Feminine Genius trilogy, right? So if it's the case that there is a disabled genius, then it would just be different and not more or less genius, or something like more or less singular.
I mean, my concern is more about Kristeva's appeal to the incomparable singularity of disability than it is about your paper. I think the paper is helpful in sort of, clarifying some issues. But thanks, we can talk about it.
Yeah, I'd enjoy that.
I found your paper very helpful also, and I was thinking about, I believe it was in the vulnerability piece that you referenced, or maybe it was in hatred, well, I guess that would be in both, since it reappears in hatred and forgiveness, but it seemed to me that she was also calling on an idea of mortality or something like that as being part of the reminder, right? So someone in a different sort of exploited or marginalized group, do you think would not necessarily remind us of our own mortality, where somebody with a disability may? Did you find that was part of the distinction that we might draw between someone with a disability and then somebody in the LGBTQ community or something like that? I remember her talking about the mortality that we all share, but because we're dying at the same time as we're living, but that it's not present to us, right? Whereas we might find it present in someone else's body or mind or something.
So I think that's helpful because death, mortality, is sort of the most extreme end of the vulnerability that she is concerned with. And it's one that maybe we can't get rid of in a way that other vulnerabilities we might be concerned with can change, because she goes through a history, a really brief, compressed history to show, well, we want to construct ourselves as almost invincible, right? We don't want to admit of limitations and that sort of thing. And it's because we have that as an ideal, that's what we set up, that's the narcissism that structures our ego. right? That is why this confrontation becomes so painful for us, or we want to reject it. And I think that mortality is the extreme end of exactly that. And but I'm trying to recall if she ever says anything about women and mortality in any other text, because I feel like she does say something about that, but I can't recall where. But
Well, thank
yeah.
you in any case. Other questions for Josh? Okay. I'd like to turn now to our final panelist. I'm very happy to introduce Amy Billingsley from the University of Oregon. Her piece is called Cogito, Ergonomics, Sum, Kristeva, Derrida, and Disability.
Over the past decade, Julia Kristeva has been a leading figure for disability rights in France through her work on creating public venues for discussions of disability and through correspondences with both the public and political officials in France. This work not only has achieved concrete results by bringing disability into public discussion, but also had a critical influence for the introduction in 2005 of the first major piece of disability legislation in France since 1975. Kristeva's work on disability thus places her in the rare category of philosophers and literary theorists who have been able to carry forward their academic skills and effect concrete ameliorative change upon the world. This work has also been criticized, however, for the framework of disability that it presents and for not adequately bringing the perspectives of disabled people into the discussion. These critiques contend that Kristeva's framework, rather than pointing towards the integration of disabled people within society, actually continues to frame disability as a marginal category of exclusion and vulnerability, thus threatening to hinder Kristeva's own goals of including disabled people as full citizens. In this essay, I will consider how Kristeva's work in revolution and poetic language can be used towards a complicated, non-dichotomous account of disability when considered at the ergonomic level of human embodiment consisting of muscle, tendon, and bone. First, I will consider Kristeva's writings on disability and critiques that she creates a problematic dichotomy between disabled people and able-bodied people. Next, I will return to her work in revolution and poetic language and her embodied expansion to Derrida's notion of difference, iterability, and fragility. This will be used to show at least one case in which Kristeva's work can be brought towards a conception of ability and disability that breaks with dichotomy, specifically in the instance of repetitive stress disorders such as carpal tunnel syndrome. Though France is a country that sees itself as affirming principles such as equality and liberty, and Kristeva borrows from much of this tradition by emphasizing equal participatory citizenship, she detects that these commitments are also part of a lineage of abstract universalism. Consequently, the emphasis on reason and universal principles that is part of France's tradition also carries a mandate for unity and indivisibility, which casts difference as a threat. In her essay, Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, and Vulnerability, Kristeva emphasizes the ways in which fears of vulnerability fuel the exclusions that people with disabilities are subjected to by able-bodied people. This exclusionary approach is also supported by the historical dominance of a medical model of disability that integrates disabled people into society as regulated objects of care rather than as citizens. Through this system, the different voices of disabled people are stifled, and able-bodied people are saved from facing their human vulnerability by denying interaction. Kristeva argues that the exclusion of disabled people is motivated by the fears and anxieties of able-bodied subjects who are confronted through disability with their, quote, limitations as living beings, end quote. These anxieties cause able-bodied people to reject, ignore, or behave arrogantly towards disabled people because their quote, irreparable, end quote, condition exposes the, quote, lack of being, end quote, and fragility that is part of being any subject. The question thus becomes how a society that is threatened by difference and composed of individuals who hide from their vulnerabilities can be brought into interaction with the people they have fearfully regulated and excluded. The disability for Kristeva is singular, unshareable, and specific. Kristeva asserts that the fear and anxiety that able-bodied people experience when encountering disabled people can be transformed into solidarity in order for the, quote, abyss, end quote, of difference separating disabled people and non-disabled people to be traversed. Freud and psychoanalysis are helpful for this because they emphasize the, quote, vulnerability of the speaking being, end quote, and can provide tools to work through the fragility of the subject and towards the acknowledgement of, quote, new bodies and new lives, end quote. Though non-disabled people experience anxiety in relation to disabled people, people with disabilities can serve as their analyzer in Kristeva's framework, allowing able-bodied people to embrace their own vulnerabilities so that successful interaction across difference can occur. By encouraging non-disabled people to face their anxieties of vulnerability, Kristeva proposes that this interaction will also involve a transformation at the level of core societal principles, as vulnerability must be added to Enlightenment principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Consequently, Kristeva sees interaction between disabled and non-disabled people as beneficial to France at large because it will enrich democratic interaction as a principle against totalitarianism and the modern debacles of, quote, hyperproductivity, all-pervasive spectacle, and suicidal religious warfare, end quote. Though Kristeva's push for the inclusion of disabled people in France has been met with much success, the approach of her work has been criticized for problematically essentializing disability and its relationship to able-bodied persons. Jan Gru's main criticism of Kristeva involves the portrayal of, quote, disability as a singular or totalizing identity marker, end quote, rather than, quote, as a fluid and context-sensitive property, end quote. Gru asserts that Kristeva's essay is not only rhetorically addressed to non-disabled people through its emphasis on how interaction with disabled people will benefit non-disabled people, but also creates a stark dichotomy between able-bodiedness and disability, often framed as, quote, two worlds, end quote. Indeed, Kristeva often emphasizes that an abyss stands between able-bodied subjects and disabled subjects who consequently occupy two different worlds. Gru argues that this dichotomy essentializes disability in relation to pain as a, quote, uniquely horrifying predicament, end quote, and as an exemplar of human vulnerability, with Kristeva's argument hinging upon asserting that disabilities involve, quote, our most singular, unshareable vulnerabilities, end quote. Gru contends that Kristeva's framework ultimately does not address the way in which disabilities are variously situated or the particularities of disabilities that may not accord to such a neat dichotomy based on pain and exclusion. Gru asserts that attempting to craft a singular account of disability, like he sees in Kristeva's work, cannot account for the ways in which the boundaries of disability are often unstable and questionable. He also stresses that it cannot account for the ways in which the category of disability has been socially and historically constructed, instead seeing Kristeva as positing a trans-historical account. Gru's final criticism involves the way in which disability is framed as a means to psychoanalyze able-bodied people and improve democracy with vulnerability, and questions whether disabled people are essentially threatening in such a way. He concludes that because of these factors, Kristeva's project risks reifying historically problematic and factually questionable concepts of disability that make it difficult to surmount its rhetoric of dichotomy. Despite criticisms for creating a dichotomy, Kristeva's emphasis on the difference between non-disabled people and people with disabilities is likely informed by her concern for affirming the different voices of disabled people such that interaction can occur across difference, rather than assimilating the experiences of people with disabilities to the experiences of non-disabled people wholesale. By emphasizing this difference, Kristeva is also highlighting the necessity of able-bodied people proceeding with caution when making policies or crafting narratives about the experiences of people with disabilities. Kristeva wants the kind of interaction that will allow disabled people to express themselves and be addressed on their own terms, rather than understood under totalizing terms set forth by non-disabled perspectives. Gru's concern is thus a question of whether Kristeva's presentation of disability is too different, such that this difference ends up essentializing disabled people in problematic ways and reifying their exclusion. To show one way in which Kristeva's theory can address the complicated boundaries of disability, I will turn to her earlier work in Revolution in Poetic Language and how it can show disability and ability as often troubled categories. Kristeva's work on disability already draws from her earlier commitments to questions of difference, the subject, and critiques of capitalism's fetishization of production and consumption. In the context of my argument, I will turn to her earlier focus on the embodied subject in relation to language and culture, with a slight detour through her expansion of Derrida, iterability, and undoing through repetition. In signature event context and on grammatology, Derrida highlights the connection between repetition and undoing in the context of writing. Derrida is critical of perspectives on writing that assert that an author's intended ideas will be preserved through writing and transmitted to others intact, enabling the repetition and dispersal of the author's meaningful presence. Instead, Derrida insists that writing has always been an imperfect and dangerous tool, subverting its demanded role of representation against demands for the author's presence and full speech. Though writing is often praised for its ability to communicate ideas in the absence of the writer, it is this absence that allows the writer's message to adopt an independent character separate from its author and their intentions even past the author's death. It is this difference in the sense of both spatial difference of varying contexts and temporal deferral of access between writer and reader that enables and undoes writing through its very iterability and repetition. I can write this essay and its words can be repeated to you, but it is this practice of iteration that enables you to play with what I am saying beyond my intentions. Through Derrida's analysis, writing is no longer tethered to the intentions of the writer or to the intended recipient, but rather open to the field of play, and in this context, even non-serious speech is as much a part of writing as more serious practices. In Revolution in Poetic Language, Kristeva argues that structural linguistics often fails to account for the speaking subject in relation to language, focusing on the symbolic remains of the subject's speech while covering over the subject and their involvement in language as a process. To fix this oversight, Kristeva emphasizes the embodied subject's role in processes of signification, seeking a materialist account of signification that is, quote, based on the subject, his formation, and his corporeal, linguistic, and social dialectic, end quote. This opens up a consideration of the subject's drives and biological urges as a crucial part of signifying processes, which Kristeva examines in relation to the semiotic and the drives, energy, and constraints of the subject's body. While undertaking this project, Kristeva notes that Derrida's emphasis on non-presence shares similarities with the semiotic's excess of meaning, but she criticizes Derrida's play of signifiers for getting lost in a, quote, deluge of meaning, end quote, that abandons both the subject and material motivations of language. Kristeva instead emphasizes the subject's navigation through language, which is produced by and in a relationship with materiality and the body, and due to this is capable of rupture and fragmentation. This allows Kristeva to reconsider Derrida's difference through materiality and drives rather than confining it to the level of simple interpretation. For Kristeva, the subject is always, quote, in process, on trial, end quote, yet experiments and practices with signs, quote, moving through the linguistic network, end quote. This movement is not determined in advance, but rather occurs through the fragile upsurges and rhythms of living embodied drives. Thus, the relationship between the semiotic and the symbolic does not involve a, quote, merely mechanical repetition of an undifferentiated identity, end quote, but instead a fragile, quote, logic of renewal, end quote, ensuring that signification itself is not static in relation to the subject. Kristeva's project of returning the embodied subject to signification allows us to consider the ways in which the act of writing troubles and undoes ability through itself, showing that Kristeva's work can give us robust accounts of disability beyond dichotomy. Recall that Derrida emphasized that writing's iterability allows its repetition for another, and yet it is this ability to repeat writing which allows it to be taken beyond the author's intentions. If we turn to Kristeva's intervention with Derrida, we are given an opening for imbuing this repetition with materiality. Hence, let us consider iterability and repetition at a different level of writing, the ergonomic. To write for another, repetition is necessary in relation to the gestures of the hand holding the pen or the fingers rhythmically dancing upon the keyboard so that the message can be recorded. We might be tempted to associate this kinesic repetition with the transmission of the author's presence and intentions when performed by an able-bodied subject, grounded through the center of their ability. The able-bodied subject in this picture wills their hand puppets to labor upon the page and grant ink to their ideas. But this level of action has its own relationship to undoing through repetition when we consider the symbolic in relation to muscle, tendon, and bone. Repetitive activities such as writing can result in a number of repetitive stress disorders that can limit one's ability to continue these activities. Carpal tunnel syndrome, for example, can result from repetitive arm movements that constrict the area in the wrist where the median nerve runs to the fingers. In this case, it is the deployment and repetition of ability that causes repetitive stress and leads to a progressive loss of ability, ranging from a slight pinching of the nerve to the loss of finger and thumb movement. Hence, at the level of ergonomic activity, writing structurally includes the possibility that its supposed ground inability, which allows writing to follow the intentions of an able-bodied person through musculoskeletal movements, will become decentered and undone through this very practice. Hence, writing, supposedly grounded in the ability of the subject and their powers of intentionality, contains the seeds of its own undoing through the play of musculoskeletal difference. And this undoing of ability is not tangential to normal writing, but part of the ergonomic act structure. Kristeva acknowledges the biological constraints of the semiotic and their relationship to drives and difference at the level of both voice and gesture, two material supports of the semiotic that repetitive stress disorders can put under strain. While Kristeva does not explicitly address the level of the ergonomic and its play of muscle, tendon, and bone in a lot of contexts, her critique of Derrida comes close to positing the ergonomic fragility of communication through her acknowledgement of the subject's fragile relationship to the symbolic. If we combine both Kristeva's earlier embodied commitments with her new commitments to the social cause of disability, this can bring us closer to theorizing a subject with muscle, tendon, and bone, and bring us to this troubled place where ability undoes itself through its own repetition. Indeed, in this context, vulnerability is most likely to arise not from disability, but from hyperability. In sum, Kristeva's work on disability has been critiqued for creating a problematic dichotomy between disability and ability. But if we consider her more recent work on disability in the context of her earlier work on materiality in relation to language, we can consider repetitive stress disorders as one area where Kristeva's work may not be so dichotomous after all. This shows us that considering the breadth of Kristeva's work continues to be significant for her more recent projects, and that it can be very helpful for crafting robust, intricate theories of disability that can be useful in a political context. I hope that this work not only points towards the continued application of Kristeva's insights towards understanding disability, but also highlights the necessity of considering kinesiology and ergonomics in relation to theory, as this area often remains somewhat under-theorized. Kristeva's emphasis on the material subject can help us move towards a subject who is more explicitly made of material in the sense of muscle, tendon, and bone. And this emphasis can bring us closer towards the insight of disability theorists such as Tobin Sievers, Tom Shakespeare, and Leonard Davis, who insist that we pay attention to both the social and material aspects of disability and the existence of ability as only a temporary phenomenon in most lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. Now we have some time for questions for her paper.
I have an ill-formulated question, but I'm concerned with the way that technology functions, the technology of writing especially, functions in Plato's Pharmacy within Disseminations by Derrida. So one of the things that I think is clearest in that work is the way that the sort of dual function of technology as both as a pharmacon, that is as poison and as medicine or as cure. And it seems like that's something that's suspended through all writing for Derrida. I mean that it comes with the nature of this form of technology that there's a perpetual vulnerability, that there's both a manipulation that is somehow surer, able, and there is also a vulnerability and an exposure to death at the same time. And I'm wondering if we could think, if that's a way in which to understand the possible dialogue between Kristeva and Derrida, specifically in form of that duality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that bringing forward the pharmacon in relation to technology could be pretty useful with what I'm trying to do with carpal tunnel syndrome, for example, because, I mean, I feel like with the dispersal of all these writing technologies and the fact that we're texting all the time, for example, that's making repetitive stress disorders quite a common thing. So I think that definitely that could be brought in relation to this. I'd have to think about it more.
So, yeah, I suppose, yeah, there would be a sense in which this was the initial suspicion of the Greeks toward the pharmacon of writing, right? That it would actually lead to a lessening of
like with
mnemonic
the phagers,
ability. Yeah, right. So, like, it would render us all disabled in a sense. That it would break down the barrier between those who have the technique and those who haven't, but by means of this sort of universalization of technology, that we all become technological beings. And I suppose with the ubiquity of technology seems to come that sort of break, or that sort of dissolution of a boundary. And I haven't really seen how Kristeva would respond to that.
Yeah, I'd have to think more about that. I mean, I think just responding to that initially from my own perspective, I'd say that technology is pretty complicated in the sense that, for example, the technology that caused me to get my repetitive stress disorders, also there's technology where I can use stuff like Dragon Naturally Speaking, which comes in and I can talk what I want to write, for example. So I'd say that there's kind of this interesting dialectic of technology, maybe with typing all the time, kind of making things difficult, but then on the other hand, there's developments like Dragon, which can help with that. But I'd say that definitely it would be interesting to consider this in relation to Kristeva's critiques of capitalism and hyperproduction, because I feel like there's kind of a repetitive stress disorder going on, perhaps even with, I think that the relationship is almost useful to think of capitalism in general as a repetitive stress disorder, if we were to bring in Marx or something like that. But yeah, I think that it's interesting in the context of hyper productivity and the way that technology might make us more vulnerable by having, by forcing everyone to produce all the time or something like that. I don't know if I'm addressing your question or just rambling.
I'd like if you could show me specific places where I can look, because I'm not familiar with but we could do that afterwards.
Yeah. Thank you.
Others for Amy?
Question. So I'm wondering if there's anything that this project could say about intellectual, cognitive, emotional disability, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I definitely think that. So I ended up focusing on physical disabilities to a large extent in this, and I think that it probably problematically leaves other disabilities behind, or maybe. But I think that's because my focus is specifically on physical repetitive stress disorders. But I mean, I think it could be interesting to look at kind of the ways in which stress might make people less, it might make people, cause them to have more stress and not be able to do things more in a cognitive sense or something like that. I think that could also be looked at. But I definitely don't think I addressed that enough in this essay. And I've been trying to think about it.
I wondered especially about some emotional disorders, given what you were saying about the drives. I don't, it's very speculative, but it'd be interesting to talk more about that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that Kristeva actually has a lot of tools in revolution in poetic language for kind of how that dichotomy could be troubled in relation to cognitive disabilities and stuff like that.
Really interesting. Thank you, Amy. Maybe now I can reintroduce all panelists to our Q&A just in the last few minutes here to see if anyone has a question that overarcs or anything remaining that you'd like to ask. So just take a moment to think if you have anything like that.
One of the things that's concerning me at present is actually the connection between disability and performance, specifically with regard to technology, because I see that as as something in common between the way in which disability is responded to, and the way in which the body is performed. As well. So I suppose something that would accompany the use of this technique, the ubiquity of technology, and at the same time the sort of the increased experience of disability that comes with that, with a dependence on technology as a way of living, would be that the same technology functions as a way of staging the body. So I don't mean in a strictly determined way, but technology frames the body and its engagement with the world. So I'm trying to make this as general as possible, but I'm wondering if there are any responses to that general connection.
So the question is about interactions between technology and any body, any particular body, or any way of experiencing the world?
Yes, us. Yes. I'm sorry to make, I have a feeling I'm making it too vague, but if there's any way to, I'll try and think of a way of making it more specific.
Are you, I'm sorry, are you, I guess, critiquing technology as a way of eliminating disability as a cultural group, or talking about technology in terms of allowing spaces to become more accessible for people with disabilities?
Could you repeat the first part, please? I'm sorry.
Yeah, critiquing technology as a way of eliminating disability as a cultural group, kind of like technology as new eugenics, both in terms of reproductive technology and then technology, like cyborgology sort of thing, that's making it so, like rendering bodies with physical impairments no longer disabled, and so removing that from its rich cultural history.
Oh, I see. Yes, that's a really interesting critique to me. I'm right now. I'm under the spell of Donna Haraway's approach, and I can see why that runs in very much in conflict with what Kristeva is doing, or with what certain engagement that I'm seeing here. That by saying that to be a cyborg is somehow essentially part of all experience, that we are all both animal and technology, is it could be a way of marginalizing like the singularity of disabled experience, right? But it's also it's on the side of identifying with the disabled person, right? And it seems like we have to make a choice. That at least seems like the way that Josh is framing the question?
I gotta write that down now.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, both shared and unshared, right? I mean, she said she doesn't want to use the phrase "we are all disabled," so she's
Right.
uncomfortable with that, which is what you're saying Donna Haraway might be amenable to in a sense.
Yeah, I
if
think
you could read it that way.
to say that we're all technological beings is to say that we're all disabled and equipping ourselves at all times, or that to equip oneself as a a way of adapting to disability is part of our all experience.
Interesting.
And that does violate the singularity of actual disabled experience, right?
Right, but if my reading of what Kristeva is trying to say is right, then what distinguishes the singularity of the disabled subject from other forms of singularity is the exclusion that disabled subjects face as a result of certain social interactions. So at least on my reading, you'd have to read technology through how that feeds into other social interactions. I didn't say anything about technology, and I'm not sure that, at least in the essays she writes on disability, that's something central to being marginalized as a disabled person for Kristeva. But maybe maybe it's the case that if we can show these connections that Amy wanted to, that there's a big role that technology plays in the exclusion or the singularity of disabled persons.
Thank
I'll
you.
talk to you about it.
Thank you.
This is a very nice exchange, and maybe you can continue it, but I think I have been told that I need to stop right away, so at the very end. So thank you so much for attending the panel, and thank you so much, Victoria, and to all of our panelists. Thank you.